Okay, I have a lot of thoughts. So this is Hey Adventures. This is my review, spoiler review of episode 4 of The Rings of Power season 2. I wrote a lot of thoughts in this. Yeah, I just wrote a lot of thoughts for this episode, but that doesn't necessarily mean something good or bad. So we'll wait to the end to see what my actual opinions of the episode were, if you can't divine them through what I say. First note that I wrote is that the Barrow-wights don't exist yet in that location, and that location being the Barrow Downs, southwest of the Shire, southeast of the Shire. They don't exist yet. They aren't in existence at the time of the Second Age. They're not in existence until the Third Age, well into the Third Age. So that's a lore issue for sure. That's an actual legitimate lore issue in this episode and in this show. I'm not going to say any more about that yet because they don't. It was just something that I wrote down in the conversation of what was going on in this episode at the beginning of the episode with the Elven company led by Elrond and Lieutenant Galadriel. So yeah, I also wrote that I like Elrond being assertive and the commander. I like that even though Galadriel is his senior, is older than him, has served as commander of the Northern armies and a whole bunch of stuff, she is only the lieutenant, whatever you want to say, of this company. Elrond is the leader and the commander, and as such, he is taking command. And I feel like this is Elrond. This is very. Of course, we didn't see this Elrond, or we didn't see Elrond at this stage in his life in any of the books. That being said, this feels closer to the Elrond that we get at the end of the Third Age, end of the Second Age, and beginning of the end of the Third Age as well. Who is the what is he? The Bannerman, I believe he's called, of Gil-galad in the last alliance of Elves and Men, where they defeat Sauron at Isildur Takes the Ring. That it feels like we're building to that Elrond, and it's actually that Elrond, and I like that. This is the episode that we meet Tom Bombadil, or this show's version of Tom Bombadil. I wanted to write something about him immediately, but I didn't have anything to say about him immediately. It took it wasn't super long, but it took a couple moments of seeing him before I had my first note to write, which is that Bombadil has the right smile. When he smiled, I was like, that's Tom Bombadil. He's still overall a bit too somber for the book, but not horrible with that little bit that we saw first of him. And so I appreciate that. Then I wrote, I hate that old man Willow is here. He doesn't move, and it's literally stealing a major plot point from Lord of the Rings. I'll come back to that in a second, but I absolutely hate that they included that. Nori and Poppy should be dead. You don't just survive getting picked up and yeeted by a cyclone. And they should absolutely not be alive anymore. Or at least without any broken bones. And there's my next note is that same thing. That was a very long drop for the hobbits, so they jumped off of they jumped off a cliff in order to evade the rider. And it was a very, very long drop for hobbits. It was a very, very long drop for humans. They would most likely have broken something, a leg or two legs or more than that or something like that. Even trained professionals would have difficulty with that long of a drop. There are trained professionals in this world, on Earth, who, if they fell off of that drop, would severely hurt themselves. It was a very, very long drop. And I know fantasy, we have to suspend our disbelief and everything. These are hobbits. They're roughly half the size of humans, and their resistance to damage is the same as that of humans. They're basically a small human in almost every way, except that they can sneak around a little bit easier than humans. But that was just it's hard to suspend disbelief when it's something so completely unbelievable. But Nori's reaction to Poppy and Merrimack flirting was just her disbelief and disgust at them. And she's like, what are you doing? And I don't know. I actually thought that, and I'll mention this a little bit later, but the actress for Nori does a very good job in this episode. Her acting in this episode is the best I've ever seen it. I'm not sure how I feel about the halflings in Rune, but I don't immediately hate it. The idea that there's these wandering halflings that are the Harfoots and some stationary halflings that are the Stores, I don't hate it, and I don't hate that the idea that the stores who were Tolkien specifically describes them as having a darker skin tone, is them being in Rune, their origins more or less being in Rune. I don't hate it. I'm okay. I'm actually okay with that. I know that the stores eventually end up along the banks of the River Anduin, and that Gollum comes from a store village, and so because of that, I kind of wish that they wouldn't have been stores, but at the same time, I don't hate it. It's not the worst thing that they've included in the show, lore-wise, at all. There's some more corny, generic fantasy dialogue from the Dark Wizard, as they're calling him, which they're very much making it out to be Saruman and Gandalf, and Saruman being the Dark Wizard, Gandalf being the stranger. And I really don't like that. Everybody is saying they would prefer that they were the Blues, and I agree. Yes, it's absolutely the way that the character is being portrayed. The stranger is absolutely being portrayed as Gandalf, and this other character absolutely physically matches the description of Saruman. And I don't like it. If they're trying to tell the story of the Blue Wizards, use the Blue Wizards. They're a part of the lore for a reason, and they would actually work into this story better than Gandalf and Saruman. But anyways, what was more corny, generic fantasy dialogue. He said, you were either very foolish or very brave, but he had absolutely no reason to say that. It was absolutely unnecessary. There was no reason, and it didn't fit the context of the scene for him to say you're either very foolish or very brave. And it's things like that, which their lines, oftentimes when they include lines like that, they're things that they have recycled from the books, directly from the books, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but they're things that are directly from the books that are just poor, that they don't fit in the situation that they're being used in, and they just don't fit. And then, it's Old Man Ironwood. It's not Old Man Willow. That's... it's just not... Yeah. Sometimes his line delivery is correct for Bombadil. This would be the actor Rory Kinnear? I don't know. And so sometimes his line delivery for Bombadil is correct, and sometimes it's not. Also, him saying the exact same thing to Ironwood as he does to Willow feels wrong to me for some reason, because it's not like it's a spell. It's just that Bombadil, it's not Bombadil. He's himself. He's the master. And as such, he can tell Old Man Willow what to do, and Old Man Willow's gonna listen. Him then doing the exact same thing to Ironwood, it just feels wrong. Saying the exact same words in the exact same order as if it's a spell. That doesn't feel right to me. That doesn't sit right with me. But then the way that he turns questions on their heads is really good. Gandalf, I'm going to call him Gandalf, the stranger, asks him, is there somebody else here? And he says, you're here, aren't you? And just the way that he twists that question and flips on its head, because, well, yeah, Gandalf's here as well. It's very Bombadil. It's very Bombadilian, and I don't mind that at all. Yeah, so certain things like that I really liked, but at the same time, you heard Bombadil singing, and you heard presumably Goldberry singing with him. And then it acts as if they're trying to imply that Goldberry isn't a real character, which is absolutely not okay with me. If they're just saying that they can Goldberry that Bombadil as Bombadil can sing, and Goldberry, his wife, can sing with him, okay, that's something different. That's something I can get behind and be okay with, even if they're not in the same location. But if they're actually trying to say that Goldberry isn't real, that's something that I do have an issue with. And I don't know that that's what they're trying to say. I think they're just trying to add mystery to this character, trying not to reveal too much about Tom Bombadil, who is the most enigmatic character in maybe all of literature, and he's that way for a reason. Tolkien wrote him that way, yet maybe because he didn't fully understand exactly what he was, but also because that's what he wanted him to be. He didn't need him to be more than Tom Bombadil. And so I appreciate the way that Bombadil describes who he is to Gandalf. It's the way that he's supposed to be described. It's his description. He calls himself the eldest. I was here before the mountains. I was here before I was here when the stars were fearful of the shadow, or something like that. I don't remember all the lines that he said, but it was very accurate to who Tom Bombadil is, if not performed in the way that it is in the books. I'll talk more about that at the end, though. He calls, so Iarwain is another one of his names. It means eldest and fatherless, and that is the name that Elrond calls Bombadil by. Bombadil's lamb is not Iarwain, because his Iarwain is not eldest and fatherless. So that's, anyways. I love the background music for him, though. That feels very right for Tom Bombadil, for the House of Tom Bombadil. It's like a not quite playful, but enigmatic, I think is probably the best term for it. An enigmatic but calm sound, and it fits with who Tom Bombadil is. So, yeah. Tom says that he's not a warrior, he's a wanderer, and that's actually not accurate either, because Gandalf specifically says of himself, Gandalf specifically says so himself, that Tom Bombadil is a moss gatherer, and that Gandalf has been a stone doomed to rolling. That's in the, gotta pull out my handy dandy Lord of the Rings Return of the King here, so that I can remember where exactly what chapter it's in. I know what chapters it's in, I just can't remember what it's called off the top of my head at the moment. It is Homeward Bound. At the end of Homeward Bound, of the chapter Homeward Bound, Gandalf goes off and leaves the hobbits, the four hobbits, and goes and talks to Tom Bombadil. In fact, I'll read this, I have it here. But if you would know, I am turning aside soon. I am going to have a long talk with Bombadil, such a talk as I have not had in all my time. He is a moss gatherer, and I have been a stone doomed to rolling. But my rolling days are ended, and now we shall have much to say to one another. So obviously it sounds as if the two characters know each other, and so I don't have a problem if they have met in the Second Age, except that Gandalf isn't here in the Second Age. But I don't have a problem that they've met in the past, that they have a history together. What I don't like is that Tom says that he's a wanderer, which he is not. He is the master of himself and the master of his land, which is the Barrow Downs and the Old Forest, and not even all that stuff. He just happens to live there, and his borders he knows, and he is the master of everything within his borders. It doesn't really make sense that he would also have a house or an estate of some sort in Rhûn, but that's kind of the least of my worries with this show. While it's not quite accurate, that part doesn't bother me, but what does bother me is that he says that he's a wanderer when he is not a wanderer. He's master. He's himself. He's not, he wouldn't use wanderer as a word to describe himself, so I don't like that. But then how does Tom know or care what Gandalf's task is? So the stranger comes down the stairs and says, is that my task? Is it my task to face Sauron? And Tom says, it's your task to face them both, referring to the Dark Wizard and Sauron. And I don't like that, because Tom doesn't care. Tom is Tom. Tom cares about what is within his borders, what he has control over, which is nothing. He has control over himself, and that's it. And so that's another little thing that just kind of rubbed me the wrong way about Tom. All right, going back now to the elf storyline and the Barrow Downs, it's one of them says in ancient days, 1,000 years ago or something like that. Those ancient days have not yet come to pass, because the Barrow Downs aren't created until the Third Age. And this is another thing, I've talked about it on Discords, I think on Liam's Discord. I haven't talked about it in a video yet, but the Barrow Downs have not yet been created in that location, which is south. Well, I guess I talked about it earlier in this episode, but in this just southeast of the Shire, they have not yet been created. And so to say, at the time in the Second Age, the Barrow Downs are not created until the Third Age. At this time in the Second Age, there's still who knows how many years for them until they're created. And so for them to say they were created in ancient days and they were created over 1,000 years ago, first off, they're elves. 1,000 years is not ancient to them. That is, Galadriel's well over 1,000 years old. At this point, Arondir, who is a young elf, is well over 1,000 years old, because he was born in Beleriand. I'll get more into that in a second here. It's just something, just like a little thing that I understand why they wanted to include the Barrow-wights in this episode. Like, I get it even from a storytelling perspective, I get why they wanted to use them, but it doesn't work with the lore. And so there's these little lore things that get me. This is going to be a long episode because I don't even think I'm halfway through yet. As much as I hate the inclusion of the whites and have a very, very different mental image of them, they do look fantastic. They are utterly horrifying, and they're not quite what I think of when I read that section of the Fog on Barrow Downs and in the, can't remember the other chapter. There's 2 chapters where they're dealing with the Barrows. And unless they're in the North Downs. If they're in the North Downs, then I might be okay with it. I'm curious now. I need to... Where's the map? Sorry, now I'm going off on a tangent. So they are acting as if they're in the North Downs. The bridge at Fornost was where they went. Okay, so they're acting as if they're in the North Downs. In which case I have less of an issue with it, because those downs could have been in existence. I don't know the exact date of when those downs were created, so I have less of an issue with that now, because I do believe, based on where the map that they showed and where they said that they were going, that the North Downs did exist. So I'm not going to comment anymore about being okay or not okay with them, because I don't actually know for certain, and I think that I'm okay with that, because for some reason I know that the South Downs, the ones southeast of the Shire, were not created until halfway through the Third Age, but these North Downs possibly were created at this time. And so I'm not going to talk to him about that. Not going to talk anymore about that. All right. Where am I at then? So yeah, I'm just going to say that they look fantastic and that they're utterly horrifying, and may not be my mental image of them, but it works. And for this show, it works. I've noticed though, okay, switching storylines back to Arondir and the Southlanders, or the humans, Arondir's accent doesn't sound as natural this season. Not sure what the problem is. I feel like it's sounding very forced and very difficult for the actor to produce. And I don't know why that is. Maybe he had less time to practice it. Maybe he didn't work on it very much or something like that. Or maybe he just had less things to say last season, and so he didn't have as much to worry about with getting the accent perfect all the time. But it sounds different this season to me. All right. And then I wrote, haha, Arondir flicks his cloak back so it doesn't get in the way, and then it falls in the way. So he flicks his cloak back and bends down onto one knee to look at the wood chips. And his cloak falls back into exactly where it would have fallen if he hadn't flicked it back. So it's just like, you could have reshot that. You could have done something else, told him not to flick the cloak or something like that. I don't know. Then we get a Princess Bride scene where Isildur sinks into the mud and Arondir dives in after him. It's very much a Princess Bride scene. That's clearly where they got the inspiration for it. Well, okay, technically Arondir doesn't dive in after him. He gets pulled in, yanked in after him, but still. I have no idea what that worm thing was, but I like it. And yes, there are nameless things in the deep places of this world. That is a line specifically said by Gandalf. And so I'm glad that Arondir knows how to quote Gandalf, who hasn't existed yet. Well, who hasn't said that line yet in the timeline of this world. Then he says, "This one we shall call supper." It doesn't quite land. The joke doesn't quite land, but it's not a bad line. It almost works. I feel like there's just a slight bit too long of a pause between there are nameless things in the deep places of this world. This one we shall call supper. I feel like if they would have tweaked the timing on that just a little bit more, it would have hit a little bit harder, and would have actually been a funny. And maybe if Arondir hadn't been the one to say it, I don't know. I feel like that's more of, I don't know who that line would fit, because it doesn't feel like it fits any of the characters in this show. But no, it feels like it would fit a dwarf. It feels like it would fit a dwarf character, not one of the elves, not even Gandalf. Although Gandalf is a very humorous character in the books. Anyways, gonna continue on. It doesn't quite land, but it's not a bad line. For once, I actually feel connected with the hobbits, or rather I feel the connection between them, with the story of Rorimas burrows and how they just kept wandering after that. The story of Rorimas from the lady that I cannot remember, don't have any idea what her name was, who's the leader of the Stoors, and then Nori's part, where they I don't think we ever found it, and we just kept wandering. I felt a connection between those characters at that time. It's the first time I've ever cared remotely about what happens to those characters. And it's largely due to Nori's acting in this episode, and it's really Nori's acting that sells that scene. Because the other gal is fine, but it's not great. But Nori actually, the way that she portrays the character in that moment is moving, and I appreciate that. I also love the fact that Arondir is just 100% ready to and willing to kill Estrid if she tries to kill Isildur. Like, I'm totally down for it. I knew exactly what type of character she was going to be from the moment she entered the scene. From the moment I saw her in a trailer, I knew exactly what type of character she was going to be, and it's exactly what she is. And so, like, Arondir just drawing the bow and being like, yeah, just try it and I'll kill you. And I was perfectly fine with that. Doesn't bother me in the slightest, because I don't know why, but it was just, I think killing a character is not necessarily something that I'm okay with, depending on how it's done and why it's done. But the fact that Arondir is ready and willing to, that I like. That's what I'm trying to say. Then Arondir says that he is of the Greenwood, which implies that he's of Greenwood the Great. But last season, was it last season or was it this season? I don't remember. At some point, he talks about how he was born in Beleriand, which means that he's not from Greenwood, which is Greenwood the Great, or Mirkwood, as it later becomes known. So, I don't get that. I'm absolutely, he could be an elf that went and worked, basically lived in and worked for the elves in Mirkwood, in Greenwood. So he could absolutely, sure, he can work for the Greenwood Wood Elves, but that is not who he is. And so for him to say he is of the Greenwood is different than saying he's a wood elf or something like that. And yeah, so that one was kind of strange, because he said he was born in Beleriand, and then he says he's of the Greenwood. So I'm not entirely sure what they were getting at with that, because it doesn't work. But I like the next question from the Entwife, because yes, indeed, he has touched axe to wood last season, and that was a key moment in those episodes. When he was digging in the trenches, when he was digging the trenches with the other elves, the other watch elves, and the orcs forced them to cut down a tree or else kill them all, or else they were gonna kill them all. Arondir decided to do it, and it was a major moment, and he took the opportunity because his boss told him, if you get a chance to see what's above the walls of this ditch, you take it and you prepare, you learn what you can so that we can prepare an escape eventually. And so he took it, and it was hard, and he had an emotional connection with the tree, and it's fitting for a Greenwood, for a wood elf. And then in this episode, the Entwife specifically asks him, have you ever touched axe to wood or something like that? And the answer is yeah, he has, and it was a hard moment for him. So yeah, anyways, let's see, where are we at? I like the names, Snaggleroot and Winterbloom. Those are very Entish names. Just in general, I love the Ents. They're portrayed as if they are Ents. They are accurate, and they make sense to how it makes sense how the Entwives could be lost. After you see the reaction that Winterbloom has in this episode, I totally buy it that she and the rest of the Entwives could disappear. And we don't know if they're lost or if they get destroyed by Sauron, which is what Tolkien himself suspected. Yeah, it's totally believable, her reaction to the orcs and to Arondir and Isildur. It just makes sense. I totally buy it. Then the Theo and Arondir reunion. That's a very good scene. We haven't seen the character development from Theo, which is unfortunate, but we have seen it a little bit with Arondir. And so seeing them come back together and make up whatever issues that they had, and then Arondir said, I'm going north I'm going to follow the trail on these orcs. You're welcome to come with me if you want. And he says, I've got promises to keep here. And then he calls them the Lord of Pelargir. It's a good scene. Estrid and Hagen is also funny, because they've totally been making it out as if Estrid is going to be a love interest for Isildur, and that he's going to lie, that she's lying about the fact that she's looking for her betrothed. And then Hagen, who has been stuck in the tree with Theo, comes and finds her, and just, I don't know, like, that's the type of thing that makes me laugh because it's a good scene. It messes with our expectations a little bit, sure, but it also adds some humor, some levity, some drama to some degree to the story, and I don't mind it. Don't have a ton of comments left, I just have some long ones left, so let's go through these. I'm okay with Galadriel being able to heal with the ring. That's technically more of an ability of Vilya, which is currently being held by Gil-galad. It's later held by Elrond, which is why Elrond is such a powerful healer in the Third Age. But it doesn't offend me with this show that Galadriel can heal with Nenya. Nor even much with the lore, since we don't completely understand exactly what every ability of each ring is or how they work within the lore. We have some ideas, and you can infer from some things that happen what the abilities are. And healing is one of the abilities that the rings seem to have, but it's more of like the wisdom of healing and not actual magical healing. But with the lore that they are creating specifically for the show, the way that they are creating the show, and the fact that the 3 rings really are just 3 rings that are all supposed to mean the same thing and do the same thing, I don't mind so much that they are a little bit, that their abilities seem to have some crossover. Because yes, in the books, Nenya is supposed to be more of like foresight and wisdom, and then Vilya is supposed to be like healing and some wisdom as well, and then Narya, the Ring of Fire, that currently Círdan has, and then he later gives it to Gandalf, is the Ring of Fire. It's like a elemental control to some degree, specifically fire control, but also some wisdom as well, and so there's each of the 3 rings have slightly different abilities, presumably based on what we know about them, and they're not all exactly the same. They're acting as if they are exactly the same in the show, and because of the way that they're created in the show, for sure there's like I can't specifically get mad at them because it's consistent with the lore that they've set up in this show, even if it's not consistent with the lore of the books, which I can get mad at them for that. But as long as they're telling a good story, that's more important to me. Then Callum, the actor, I can't remember his elf's name. Anyways, the elf that just got shot in the stomach, he says she did that to save us, and Elrond says no, she did it to save the ring, and that's very true. But at the same time, it is a noble sacrifice, because she can't allow that ring to fall into the orc hands, but somebody does still have to stay back, and she's the best one to do it, presumably, based on what they've set up in the show. And then at the last scene in the show is Galadriel with her bow drawn, and Adar reaches out and grabs the arrow, puts the flame out on the arrow, and says, "A star shines on the hour of our meeting, Lady Galadriel," which is the elven greeting. And it's just a perfect moment because, once again, Adar is proving to be one of the best things about this show. He's one of the most Tolkienian things about this show, even if he doesn't specifically exist in the lore. The way that they're treating him is very Tolkienian in many ways. And so yes, him using that elven greeting with Galadriel, I'm 100% okay with it. I like Adar. All right, these last couple of things are kind of generic wrap-up thoughts. One of them is actually the end credits song. So Tom Bombadil's song, I think it's just called Old Tom Bombadil is the title of the song. I don't love the performance at the end of the episode. I don't hate it. I've listened to it several times since I watched the episode, and I don't hate it. It's solid performance, but it's not like, I feel like somebody else could just do it better. But I love the composition. I love the melody that they set these words to. I love the fact that it is Tom Bombadil's song, and it feels like Tom Bombadil singing it. It's not quite the crazy performance that Andy Serkis gave to Tom Bombadil in his audiobook recording, but it's still very Bombadilian, and so I'm okay with that. So then we get into kind of my wrap-up thoughts. This is a weird episode because on the one hand, it's messing with so many lore things, and they're not completely accurate. But then on the other hand, it was genuinely a good story in this episode, and I was not offended by any of the choices they made. It feels as if it's remaining a bit more respectful to the lore, even when it does change things drastically. And this is sometimes kind of hard to comprehend, hard to wrap your head around when they make changes that are so drastic to the story, to the movie, to the show, to the things that are different from what is said in the books. That makes it a bad adaptation. But if they're still somehow respecting the lore, which it does, this episode genuinely felt like they were attempting to respect the lore. I'm okay with it. I understand that adaptation is very different, and that the two mediums between a TV show and a book are very different mediums, and there have to be changes that are made. Would I have done all this stuff differently? Absolutely I would. But that means that I would have to have the rights to everything. If I were to make a Second Age show, I'd want the rights to the Silmarillion and to Unfinished Tales, and then as well as the Lord of the Rings and the appendices. If I could have all of those things, then I would make a very different show than what they're creating. But this episode, for kind of the first time, I said that I liked episode 2 and that I enjoyed episode 2 for kind of the first time in the show. This episode also genuinely feels like they are respecting the lore. Even though it's different and they're doing things differently and it's not how I imagined it and it's not exactly how it's written in the book or described in the book, it feels respectful in a lot of ways. Some more thoughts on Tom Bombadil, because of course I have more thoughts on Tom Bombadil. Is Tom Bombadil perfect? Is Bombadil perfect in the show? No, he's not. But he fits this show. He's so weird in Lord of the Rings because he needs to be. In that moment and for that story, the weirdness of Tom Bombadil, the wackiness, the complete change of tone is very necessary because of the story that is The Lord of the Rings, which is a memoir of 4 hobbits during the event of the War of the Ring. And for that story, for the story of those 4 hobbits, Tom Bombadil is extremely necessary, and his weirdness is extremely necessary for their story. However, in this story in the Rings of Power, they don't need it to be quite that weird. As much as I wish we saw the perfect Tom Bombadil, this is the right Bombadil for this show. And that's an important difference, and that is something important to note when telling a different story, when making an adaptation, when you're telling the story of the Rings of Power rather than the Lord of the Rings. It's important to know how to use the character correctly in your show, in your story that you're telling. And I feel like Bombadil was, for the most part, with a few minor exceptions, he was used correctly. My kind of last thoughts before my ratings. I enjoyed this. I genuinely enjoyed this episode. It made me want to go outside and appreciate nature to some degree, just as Tolkien's works always do when I read them, and even the Peter Jackson films do to a lesser degree. This felt like, it didn't feel like something Tolkien would have written, but it felt honoring, and it felt the same in many ways as something that Tolkien could have written. And so I'm okay with it. This episode I had a good time with. I enjoyed. I don't think there was anything in this episode that no, that's not true. The Southlander stuff, I didn't care for the Arondir and Isildur storyline in this episode. A few things, yes, but the whole search for Theo part I didn't love. Once they found the Ents, that stuff I liked. Once they found Theo, that stuff I liked. But the actual search for Theo was not my favorite. All right, so what is my rating? As an episode of a fantasy TV show, I would rate this like an 8.5 out of 10, which is rather high. I thought this was a genuinely good episode of fantasy television. As an episode of Lord of the Rings, I mentioned how it may not be exactly as things are written, but I feel like it was honoring to Tolkien to some degree, and so I put this as like a 7.5 out of 10. I think that's the highest I've ever rated an episode of this show, and I genuinely had a good time watching this show. The story is improving. Is it the best show ever? No, still no. But with episode 2 and with episode 4, if they can have less episodes like episode 3 and episode 1 as they move forward, this could end up with a strong second season and the potential for seasons 3, 4, and 5 to be good, to be a good show. That would be awesome. I would love for that to happen. I would love for this show to, even with its rough start, to end as something memorable. and not memorable because it's horrible. So anyways, that is my thoughts for The Rings of Power Season 2, Episode 4, my spoiler thoughts, notes, whatever you want to call it, because it is kind of a review, but not really. It's mostly just me as a Tolkien fan talking through the things that I liked or that I didn't like about the show, and not actually doing an overview of what happens. But anyways, thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.